Today we're going to welcome Sarah Savage, who's Senior Policy Analyst for the Boston Federal Bank. And the bank focuses a lot on promoting employment opportunities and the connection between job quality and child care access. Overall, the Boston Fed promotes sound economic growth, financial stability, and provides information in a real accessible way. And last summer, the Boston Fed President Collins was here in Bangor and got to listen to her, and she talked about economic opportunities and challenges. And it was part of a meeting organized by the Bangor Chamber of Commerce. And I was really pleased to see that the Fed president in Boston remembers rural Maine and rural New England. So that's really good. But and the research the bank does is so reliable and top notch. And especially, Sarah, your work is really accessible. And you've written several extensive briefs about job quality and childcare access. But what I've really liked about it for us is 2/3 of the state, we provide workforce development programming through the federal government and the Maine Department of Labor. And access to quality job care, childcare is really essential. So what I liked about your briefs is it makes it real for us. So overall, why is the Boston Fed doing research on childcare?
Great, I will dive right into that, but I quickly do need to say that the views I express are my own and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, the Federal Reserve System, or the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. But the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate of maximum sustainable employment and price stability. So on the first point, we know that childcare can be a barrier to work for many parents. And multiple Fed banks actually have done research on childcare to look at it, look at the needs on or the problem on a local or state level, and also to look at supply constraints of childcare and how those might have implications for parents' ability to work. At the Fed, we can help elevate childcare as an economic issue. We conduct and share research. When we first started this area of work in 2019, we brought together a family council of 13 parents from Greater Boston to help us understand what experiencing access challenges can look like. And that really helped inform our thinking and our research. We then conducted some original research, interviewing mothers across Massachusetts about their childcare access challenges and trade-offs they needed to make. We also surveyed parents across New England, asking both about childcare usage and their employment. And we also worked to leverage this research. We've worked with partners across most of the states in New England to convene employers and business leaders. And this includes a great meeting we had in Maine at Colby College to talk about the research, so to leverage the research and talk about what employers have done and can do to support their working parents.
Yeah, and I think one of the reports said you reached out to 2,000 New England mothers. Is that right?
Yes. So the survey was open to parents, mothers, and fathers, but because of the overwhelming response from mothers and because it is an issue that disproportionately impacts mothers, we limited our analysis to the nearly 2,100 mothers in our sample for the three briefs that we wrote.
So in your findings, why is childcare inaccessible for so many working families? And how does that impact the workforce? And how do we further engage employers?
Yeah. So when we say childcare access, oftentimes people think access and affordability are kind of interchangeable. But, you know, access is about so much more than just affordability, though I will mention licensed childcare is very expensive. And we all know that. And not that all parents use licensed childcare. They may tag team with another parent. They may use friends and family. But if they have no choice but to use licensed, developmentally appropriate childcare, it's very expensive. Childcare Aware is an organization that puts out cost data every year. And in Maine, it estimated in 2024 that it would cost to send a toddler to a childcare center. It could cost as much as 12% of median family income for a married couple family, or 36% of median family income for a single parent family. But it's also, there are other factors besides affordability. Quality can be an issue. I have spoken to mothers that have opted not to work because they couldn't find childcare that they felt comfortable with. It could have been due to safety concerns, or whether it was they thought it was developmentally appropriate. Also, it can be very challenging for parents who work a non-traditional schedule and have nobody to watch a child during an evening, weekend, or early morning hour. So that can really matter as well. My research looks at access challenges in a way where I'm kind of limited to how I asked about it in the survey, but I define it as either needing care. So I define a mother as having an access challenge if they need care but couldn't get care. And also I look at mothers who used care but used less care than they needed, since those are two different ways to look at access. And I found that lower income mothers were more than 20 percentage points more likely to forego needed care than higher income mothers. I found that employed mothers were also, mothers who were not working were also at least 20 percentage points more likely to forego needed care than working mothers. And so on the other measure of using less care than needed, interestingly, middle income mothers, and here I define that as between, I know it seems low at this point, but between 50,000 and 99,000 for family income. Middle income mothers were more likely to use less care than they needed than either lower income mothers or higher income mothers. And this could be because middle income mothers are less likely to be eligible for a childcare subsidy, but they're also less likely to be able to pay out of pocket for as much care as they need as higher income mothers.
Yeah. And, in the workforce programs we operate, we're finding our participants have a hard time achieving economic success. And in that process, preserving dignity and a sense of belonging through our programs. How does childcare availability help them succeed? And what are some of the job quality indicators you look at to demonstrate that they're succeeding?
Well, my research doesn't speak to that in particular, although, we did look at, in the third brief that came out, I looked at characteristics of jobs to see if it could matter for how mothers access childcare. So for instance, I was able to look at whether a mother had access to remote work, flexibility, or paid sick leave, which I coded as more favorable to work-life balance. I also looked at if they worked multiple jobs, had a changing schedule set by an employer, or had non-traditional work hours, which I coded as less favorable to work-life balance. And I found that the mothers with exposure to the more favorable work-life balance characteristics had increased odds of using childcare, and those in particular paid sick leave, and those with exposure to more the less favorable work-life balance characteristics had increased odds of foregoing needed care. So that is, can be somewhat indicative that like how a parent works really matters, and the job quality they have can potentially intersect with their ability to access care. And scholars have pointed out it's not just, like I mentioned, well, it's affordability, quality, and availability, meaning where and when and for whom it's available, but it's also context. What does the community have available for childcare, and what are the mothers or parents' employment demands? Those employment demands can very much are part of the equation in their childcare decision making, and whether or not they're able to navigate the options that are available to them.
Right. How do we, using this data and all this research, translate that to being valuable to employers and having them make sense of why this is important?
So different employers are in different positions, which we very much are sensitive to. And for instance, I worked with some colleagues across the Fed system on an article where we recognize that one size certainly does not fit all for employers. There are different occupations and industries that just don't lend themselves to remote work and flexibility. Also, firm size can really matter. So there is a lot of movement among, getting employers involved, whether it's initiated by employers or employer groups, or whether it's initiated in a community to say, hey, employers could make potentially strong partners. Why don't we work with employers? But one of the things my colleagues across the Fed banks who I worked with noticed was there's not a lot, like there are these great compendiums for employers that say, here are different things you can do. You can do some, flexibility, stipends, on-site childcare, near-site childcare, emergency backup care. But then there was nothing that sort of took into consideration, well, small businesses might have more constraints, and it might be a bit more difficult for small businesses to do some of these things that are detailed nicely in these compendiums, which are valuable, but how to customize for certain employers. So we all kind of reached within our respective districts, New England being, most of New England being Boston's, and to see if we could find any examples of what small businesses have done to support their workers' childcare needs. And a couple of good examples that I'll bring up from New England that stood out to us. There was one at Maine Woods Company up in Portage, Maine, and the general manager was saying how their HR person kept saying, I could just get this person if we had childcare, and it just kept coming up. And after hearing it numerous times, he made a pitch to sister companies, which were also small businesses, to say, hey, we really need to invest in some childcare in our community. And they did invest in a nonprofit childcare center that isn't necessarily, it's not on site, it's not just for their workers, but they realized their community needs it. So it will be an option to help them with hiring. Another example is Badger, which is a body products manufacturer in Gilsum, New Hampshire, and they have a Bring Your Babies to Work program. So a new parent can bring a baby to work up until 6 months, or when the baby starts crawling, I guess whichever comes first, and work on a sort of light duty. But it's been extremely popular. There's a lot of women in leadership, not necessarily attributable to that, but they don't know for sure, but I'm sure it probably doesn't hurt. And it's interesting. It stood out to us because they might not be able to do flexibility in the traditional sense of when we think of flexible hours or remote work, but they did something creative and found, this was something that works for us. So not, one size certainly doesn't fit all. And sometimes, it comes down to figuring out a return on investment for a particular employer and what their particular need is, what problem they're trying to solve with their workforce. And then there's growing momentum around public-private partnerships and doing things within a state or community to really work on the supply as opposed to doing something vertically within an actual organization. So there's lots of options, and it's very exciting because a lot's being experimented with and learned about right now.
And do you think that's happening increasingly so?
When you look at the data on, and this is also in the article where we talk about the small businesses and small business examples, when you look at data on how common it is for civilian workers to have access to childcare, it's very low. And by the way that it's defined in a particular census data set is whether there's sort of partial or full, support for their childcare. So the numbers are really low, especially if you look at it by firm size. Among smaller organizations, it's extremely low. And then when you look at things like dependable care, flexible spending accounts. Those are probably the most common, but again, you see patterns by firm size where the smallest firms are least likely to offer them. And something like on-site care, that's even extremely low among, employers with 5,000 or more
Mm.
workers. So we keep hearing about these examples, and I think the examples get elevated, but I wouldn't say that they're that common. I think people realize that there's a lot of potential because the business model of childcare just doesn't work the way that it's set up. It's unlike the K through 12 system, it's a mostly private market, and parents are mostly paying out of pocket unless they're eligible and have access to a childcare subsidy, which are for low-income families. And so it's a private market. Also, unlike the K through 12 system with bigger kids and older kids, you can't simply have 15 to 20 infants and toddlers in a room with a teacher. You have to have much lower ratios. So it makes it very labor intensive and very costly. But at the same time, you have parents, it's very costly. Parents are paying a lot, but at the same time, the childcare workers themselves make low wages. So it's my Cleveland Fed colleague wrote a report stating that they're like the 10th lowest median wage. And the turnover is really high. It's like
Right.
65% higher than the typical occupation, according to my Cleveland Fed colleague's report. So it's a very challenging business model. And some sort of, being agnostic to what type of funding is needed, some other intervention is needed. And employers do represent, it's in their best interest. It costs billions of dollars a year in terms of what employers lose due to childcare disruptions, according to a report by Ready Nation. They keep putting out a report every year with the amount going up and up in terms of what it costs the economy. So there's momentum around engaging employers, but I will say, one piece that I do feel like is a sticking point, even though there is this momentum, is that, and I experienced this when we did convenings with employers and business leaders, they can be really interested in wanting to do something, but they tend to, and rightfully so, they lack the expertise around childcare. So without a sort of, I think, infrastructure for employers to plug into, it can just sort of fizzle, since it's not what they do. They're not in the space of childcare. So to take that on, regardless of what option they're considering, can seem probably really daunting and out of their wheelhouse. So I believe that's one of the reasons why there could be a lot of interest, but it might not always materialize.
That's a really good point. And that kind of capacity building, we have a similar thing with workforce housing, where larger businesses want to get engaged with it, but don't know the steps to do that. So we're working with municipalities and the state government and others on how to do that, how to help people. Because while it seems daunting, if they want to do it, we need to help them do it. And here in rural Maine, besides affordable housing, is public transportation issues. So how do some of those standing barriers kind of make this the perfect storm for a young mother in need of childcare?
You mean some of the barriers of housing and transportation?
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, when you add them all up together, it's quite a bit.
It is quite a bit.
And healthcare costs too.
Right. It's, if there's a way for thinking about them holistically, I mean, I think what you're getting at is that some of this is, needs to happen at local levels, because to get how those different things sort of pile on and intersect is hard to understand at too high a level. But at a local level, you can sort of see from a parent perspective. And again, like going back to the family council and engaging residents and trying to make things resident centered, mother centered, depending on what we're talking about. to understand how they experience these different pieces, how they're, and I think that's where research is really important, to understand what are the lived experiences of dealing with these barriers all at once. So I would just encourage, local level needs assessments and trying to understand these from a more grounded perspective, because it's very hard to sort of, I think sometimes quantitative data can only go so far, and that's where some qualitative data and engaging with residents, can be helpful.
Right,
It's a
right.
step. It's a step in the process. It's not the
Yeah.
answer, but it can be an important step.
It's a good step. It's a step forward. You've done previous research on substance abuse, and a lot of our participants in our workforce program are battling that. How has that come up in terms of looking at childcare access? And
it hasn't come up, but it's an interesting potential intersection. So I will speak to the way I looked at it when I was at the University of Georgia doing research. It was really looking at, and I'm sure I could find a link if I think about it, but I would think the link is more, if something is shown to work or we know the answer, why don't we implement it? I think that's the common thread. So the way I looked at the work I was doing on substance abuse was really, if there's an evidence-based practice and a substance abuse treatment center knows about it and the evidence is there, why wouldn't they adopt it? Why wouldn't they use it? And I think that is a very compelling question for childcare. If we can sort of see paths to addressing childcare needs, or not we, but if intermediaries can see it, if different actors can see it, why don't we, take the steps?
right, right. So all this research you do, which is prolific, how has being a mother informed your research?
Well, with childcare in particular, it's really mapped on, I will say, and that was a complete coincidence. So,
You didn't
like
do
I
it
said,
to enhance your research?
but it really helped. I mean, my daughter was a toddler in center-based care when we were thinking about this topic. So I would, have conversations with the center director, like real conversations, and I was trying to educate myself both as a researcher potentially diving into this issue, but it was also helpful as a mother. And I would say that being able to experience it and relate to parents' challenges, I do think it gave me a window in that I really appreciated, and I tried to sort of lean on, never in a biased way, but just to try to understand the nuance and just sort of I hate to use this word, it might sound jargony, but the multidimensionality of it, because it's not just one thing. Like I said, it's not just affordability, it's so many things. And so I really appreciated having that lived experience while I was diving into the literature, talking to researchers and stakeholders. I feel like it was, it really grounded me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this has been so helpful understanding the economic impact of childcare, and your research. We'll distribute it to the whole group, all the briefs. So you'll see a jump an online. But really, is there any final comments for rural Maine based on your research?
I will point you to also the piece I did on the small businesses, because I think, I really do think the point that there are ways to be creative with solutions. It can take some energy, but just to see what other employers have done, and the examples that I gave, not only were they small businesses, but Portage at least is in a more rural location. So
yes, it is.
yeah. So I think being open to creativity and yeah, just, needs assessments as well. Those are always a good step, whether as an employer doing a needs assessment with their workers or as communities thinking about how to do them.
Right. Well, the kind of research you're doing and what Boston Fed does, you pass along to your colleagues that everybody up in Maine appreciates it, and we're trying to take stock at it and implement things after reviewing. So I just
Great.
want to thank you for being here, and we'll see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Sarah.